And the mission at Langsford is to help kids develop a joy of reading. And for that to happen, a cascade has to be built up, and an enormous amount of dominoes need to fall the right way for that to happen. And we're very fortunate that for many kids that happens. But I think what will be valuable for you today is to have a conscious appreciation for all that has to happen. Whether you're in preschool watching language emerge for a baby or child, all the way up to a senior in high school who's preparing for their final AP exam. There's just so much that needs to happen, and there's so many ways that we can intervene positively in that if we understand the process. And even if you're a math teacher where you are working with someone through word problems, there's still a lot that has to happen in the language system before you really engage the numeracy system. So not every part will be equally interesting for everyone, but I do believe that there's a piece here for everyone. And as well as understanding that reading is not just something that happens in K through 3. Okay, so let's jump in. I'd like you to read this and take a second with that. While you were reading this, your brain was accomplishing a truly amazing feat. Your eyes scanned the page in short, jerky movements. 4 or 5 times per second, your gaze stops just long enough to recognize a word or two. You're, of course, completely unaware of this jerky intake of information. It's only the sounds and the meanings of the words that reach your conscious mind. But these black marks on that white page projected on your retina evoke an entire universe. How wonderfully joyful it is to watch these babies just speak.
While I was playing catch with Mickey, and a magical aroma filled the air, I saw the neighbors standing on their porch with their eyes closed, smelling the sky. They took deep breaths of air like they were trying to eat the smell. The end.
Learning to speak is this natural process. We're pre-wired for it. Whatever community we are born into and grow, we learn to speak that language. You don't have to go to school to do that. Learning to speak is a cultural invention. It's truly this invented process. This process of taking language in through vision is truly invented. It's an acquired ability. It's only a few thousand years old. We don't have any dedicated brain hardware to do that task. And it's really only through years of work that it runs smoothly enough so that we can forget that we actually do it. It turns out that all over the world, the same brain regions are activated to decode a written word. Certain brain circuits remain open to these changes in the environment, and we're able to adapt and turn this sort of predisposition for something else into something we're able to use for reading. But it's these mechanisms that tell us so much because that good readers go about learning to read in the same way. And that becomes so important that as we learn to read, these same mechanisms in the brain are repurposed. And that tells us again that good readers go about learning to read in the same way. So the question is not, does reading need to be taught? The question is, how explicit, how intensive, and how systematic does instruction need to be, and how do you support it so that it's sustained well? So the question is this really an issue? Like, is this really a thing we need to be aware of or be attentive to? It just happens well enough for most kids, right? Well, not really. So if we look in Kentucky, the nation's report card, this is a reoccurring assessment done by the federal government called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. If we look at Kentucky, we see that 25% of kids in 4th grade are below basic levels of reading. In Jefferson County, we're at 33%, and 65% of kids are below proficiency. So maybe that's a 4th grade thing. Like, right by the time they roll up the grades, they're in a better place, right? So here's 8th grade. Jefferson County, 30% below basic levels and 69% below proficient. Below proficient. So then there's proficient and then there's advanced. This is below proficient. So let's go with this. So we're at 8th graders here, but maybe this is a new thing. Maybe this is something that has just occurred recently. So let's look at this since 1992, and this is Jefferson County. What do you notice about the slope of this line? Is it pretty steep or are we pretty flat? Pretty flat. We're not really doing any better than we did in 1992. Same with 8th grade. But maybe it's just a Kentucky thing. Maybe nationally they have this figured out. It just hasn't made it to Kentucky yet, or Jefferson County especially. Nope. That's 4th grade. Pretty steep or pretty flat? Pretty flat. Same in 8th. So this lack of progress existed well before 1992, and it didn't escape, believe it or not, the Congress that we had at the time. In 1965, they realized that reading scores were not progressing, and they asked some fundamentally important questions. What does it take to develop a nation of readers? And who's going to figure that out? Well, it turns out that that matters a lot because reading skills absolutely impact the welfare of children. So we have a branch of our federal government that does biomedical quality research, and that's called the NIH. And specifically, it was the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development that was charged with figuring this out. How do kids learn to read? Where do they get stuck? And what can we do about it? And so to that end, over the years, we've had 48 research sites, 42 in the US, 6 international. So it wasn't just looking at English, it was looking at other languages, because we need to understand that to better understand our own language. Over 120 researchers, 34,000 people, including 20,000 typical readers, 14,000 with reading difficulty, and over 2,500 research articles of high quality were published. So right out of that, we can shake out some important findings. One is, we know that reading disabilities affect about 10 million children, or somewhere around 20%. We know that boys and girls are equally at risk and show the difficulties equally. We do know that, particularly in looking at public schools, that boys are identified more often than girls, but they persist equally. It is a persistent deficit. We know that just from the slides we looked at. You don't actually have to be a world-class researcher to realize that not a lot happened from 4th grade to 8th grade in these bars we looked at. So kids do not outgrow the difficulties that they have early on in reading. One of the most robust studies was done out of Yale University called the Connecticut Longitudinal Study, and they followed a cohort of children from kindergarten all the way through into adulthood. And what they found is that basically 74% of kids who had learning disabilities in 3rd grade had the same difficulty in 9th grade and on. So again, kids don't outgrow the reading difficulties that they have. It's not a bimodal curve. You don't either have a learning disability or you don't. Now, for criteria for deciding eligibility in a public school, they do create a cutoff point, but in truth, it falls equally upon a distribution. So it's a pretty solid bell curve. The challenge, of course, is where do you put a cutoff point? And we don't do that well, sadly, in this country. So just because someone's not labeled as having a learning difficulty or reading difficulty doesn't mean that that person is where they need to be for reading. They may not read to learn. They may not read for enjoyment. They report having difficulty in reading because they can't read the words quickly and they don't comprehend what they read. They don't have a learning disability, but certainly learning to read is not joyful or fun for them, for many. And then if we start looking at the 20% of students who have severe reading difficulty, that actually shakes out to give us some pretty good indicators of what's going on there. We know that there's a core deficit. That deficit is phonological in nature, which is a deep language skill in our brain. We know where that happens in the brain. We know where that thinking needs to be going on that's not, and we can see through neuroimaging studies when that part of the brain is activated and how that rolls out to develop a pretty efficient reader. We know when that's not happening, and we know the parts of the brain that try to come in and recruit to make up for that weakness, but it's not enough. And that's supported by over 100,000 studies that converge on the same findings. So we know that children who fall behind in first grade have a 1 in 8 chance of ever catching up. We know that phonemic awareness is the single biggest predictor in reading success between kindergarten and second grade. And we know that phonemic awareness is more highly related to learning to read than tests of general intelligence, reading readiness, and listening comprehension. When there is a deficit in these phonological components of language, we can see a pretty wide gap by 5th grade. So when we take the lowest 20% of children who have difficulty in phonemic awareness, and we look at how that plays out in word reading, their ability just to read words, we know that by 5th grade, that's a pretty wide gap. But what's most actionable here is what's happening here. We can see the gap. The problem is it's not very big, but it's there. So this is when we need to intervene with children across the country and recognize that what we believe and want to see is that all kids learn to read. It's this wonderful thing. I learned to do it. Everyone ought to be able to learn to do it. So it'll just happen. We need to give them more time. The light bulb will click on. And while we're waiting, and it gets passed from in traditional education from the 1st grade to the 2nd grade to the 3rd grade to the 4th grade, that gap gets wider and wider. But someone could say, well, does word reading matter? Like, reading is not about just word calling. Reading is about something else. What's it about? Why do we read? What's the whole purpose? Yeah, it's comprehension. So does it impact comprehension? Well, guess what? Bottom 20% of kids in phonemic awareness looking at reading comprehension through the grades, boom, big and wide. Turns out if you can't read words well, it's really hard to understand what you read. And again, it's detectable and actionable even in the earliest grades. So early identification and support is absolutely critical. So what happened is this information is pouring out of NIH. And how do researchers publish findings? Help me out here, team. If you're a researcher, you've done a large-scale study, you've got meaningful findings, where do you report that? You report that in a journal article. Most teachers get education through textbooks. And so across the country, we have an unhitching of what we know to be true in science and how traditional pre-service education teachers get taught. And so these key things have not really made it yet into the classrooms. There was a panel convened, and they said, we need to take this vital information that absolutely impacts the welfare of children and disseminate it outside a journal article in a meaningful report that is accessible and free to everyone. And that is called the National Reading Panel report. And it did basically a large meta-analysis and basically just a reporting of over 100,000 studies that have been published since 1966, but they had to meet one criteria. It had to meet biomedical quality research. So all the research that had been done that only had no controls or small sample sets or were only case studies didn't make the cut. It's only the stuff that was really evidence-based. And we come up with 5 key pillars. phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. But it matters that someone really understand the difference between phonemic awareness and phonics because they're different things and they're taught differently. And it matters that there are best practices under each of these. So this was endorsed then by all the leading important groups, American Federation of Teachers, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, National Institute of Literacy, U.S. Department of Education. So there's wide acceptance about this. And that gives us the important opportunity to move beyond what historically and still shows up as a problematic debate, which is, do we teach whole language or phonics? So if you understand that this is a cascade, pulling two arbitrary key parts of the cascade and then saying, do we do one or the other, is a completely uninformed conversation. There's a lot more that needs to happen before, during, and after that. So our hope is that this idea of what used to be called the reading wars in the 80s and into the 90s is really in our rearview mirror, that there are a whole series of necessary but not in and of itself conditions to become a reader. Each step is necessary, but in and of itself not sufficient to develop reading. So what are those areas and what does that look like?
Yeah, we're talking about the 5 basic fundamentals of reading. And then, Stephen, what are we talking about here?
5 basic building blocks to reading.
Okay.
Phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension.
And then and we got actually different sections here. Right now they're working on what part?
We're working on phonemic awareness, and what that is the awareness of sounds, that before reading really starts, you have to be able to appreciate that there are 44 sounds in our spoken language.
And so she's mixing up different sounds together. Even though they're nonsense words, she has to figure out, what the next sound is.
Exactly. What's the identity of that sound, and what sequence does that sound come in?
And then we go on to the next section here. What are we doing?
Well, with 44 sounds, we've got to transition to letters, and there are 26 alphabet letters. So phonics goes about mapping those sounds to letters. Now, you can automatically realize that we don't have enough letters to match all the sounds. So those letters need to combine in certain ways in order to represent all the sounds we need to read.
Practice, practice, practice. And then right here, we're doing a little practicing with the fluency.
That's right. So now that you can sound out a word, one needs to get fluent enough to start beginning to get meaning out. So fluency practice gives us specific ways to build the speed and competency in reading.
And you were saying silent reading doesn't work so well. Reading out loud
That's
kinda
right.
helps you with that flow.
That's right. Reading aloud with guidance and feedback is how you really build that fluency. And then the whole reason we read is to get meaning from print. First step in that is vocabulary. And so it's one thing to read along in a book, but when you come across a word you don't know, it becomes really important to take the time to learn that word. And so that's best done by putting words on cards and practicing. And then on cards, if you can see at Ellie there in the back, she's got a picture.
Ellie,
of
what
the
we
card.
got? What's the word?
Lament.
Lament. Oh, and it's a little picture of someone crying. So if you're lamenting, you're crying, you're sad.
Very sad.
You're
You're expressing sorrow.
Very sad, expressing sorrow. I'll take that because I'm going to use that later in a phrase later on today. And then right over here, pictures and words going together.
Exactly. So now that you can read across that page, you know what all the individual words mean. The whole goal next, to bring it to life, to bring it real, is to imagine the story in your mind's eye. See the movie.
And then building a movie from textbooks like biology books, a little trickier than just a novel.
It is, and that's what Ethan's working on there now. And you know that old saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. The whole adage of comprehension is to take those 1,000 words and get your own picture.
And you know what? It comes to this moment in the show for us that I am going to lament and feel sad that we're going to leave you guys.
So let's step into each one of those pieces. So 5 components. Let's start with phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is our ability to perceive the individual sounds in our spoken language. Phoneme is the smallest unit of speech, and it's generally agreed to be 44 of these individual sounds that make up all the words we speak. And about 20% of the population has a difficulty perceiving these sounds, which is what we talked about earlier. Let's do a little exercise here so that we're all on the same page with this. This is fundamental, but it's essential, especially if you're part of a school where literacy is highly valued. Everyone should have equal understanding of the components and some level of detail about them. So say the word mom out loud. Now I would like you to say that one sound at a time. Ah, Great, so 3 sounds. I'd like you to say the next word out loud, box. Now hold up the number of fingers you would need to represent each one of those sounds. So how many sounds are in that word? Hold up, jump in there. So we have a nice variety of answers. Let's do this one sound at a time. Ba, ah, k, s. 4 sounds. 3 letters, but one of those letters represents or holds the place for 2 sounds. Okay, let's do another. Let's do stop. Now, go ahead and say the word out loud. Stop. Yep. Now say it one sound at a time. S, t, ah, p. So 4 sounds, 4 letters, as it turns out, but that's phonics. 4 sounds. Let's do one more. Thought. Say the word out loud. Thought. 3 sounds. So when we're talking about phonemic awareness, we're talking about something that happens in the absence of print. So print is not present during a phonemic awareness task. It has to do with our ability to perceive those individual sounds that fold up into a spoken word. An example of how this is applied sometimes on a playground is Pig Latin. And certain people could talk in Pig Latin back and forth. I was not one of those people, sadly. I had terrific difficulty in this personally. But I now understand that someone who had the ability to say a word, strip the first sound off, stick it at the end, had pretty good phonemic awareness skills. So that's an example of a phonemic awareness task. So this kind of thing may seem like play, but it requires explicit teaching, highly structured practice that then helps develop an independent reader. So these are really some key pieces that are being taught and measured and attended to in this early in the early literacy program. Here.
Phonemes are the smallest sound units in the English language. The National Reading Panel found the most effective way to teach children to read is through systematic and explicit manipulation of phonemes in words in a balanced reading program.
Say fan slowly. An. Good. Say mom slowly.
So as this scales up, of course, whether we're in middle school or high school and we're doing a vocabulary word, it's important that you be able to both speak each phoneme aloud and make sure that that student is not just memorizing the word as a whole chunk, but actually understands how that word is built phonetically. I want to take one quick little piece here. I want to step into the idea of dyslexia. Now, as you can see on both the Newsweek and Time magazine article cover, and the Newsweek article, the dyslexia word is sort of jumbled out there. On the Time article, the Time cover, the B and D are reversed. And so this feeds into this narrative that people who have dyslexia see letters or words upside down or backwards, or somehow there's some visual disturbance that's interrupting their literacy. And it turns out that that's not correct at all. People who have dyslexia do not suffer from a breakdown in their visual system. It is caused by an early breakdown in the phonological components of language, these very ones we've talked about. And when someone has a deficit in that area, it prevents the rest of the reading cascade from evolving. And so when someone then can't do the rest of the reading process because they have some different neurological wiring that predisposes them to not develop good phonemic awareness skills, they go on and develop dyslexia. So again, that can be identified early and treated, and the earlier we treat that, as educators, the better the results are. Again, we understand very well what happens in that cascade. We understand the parts of the brain that aren't working the way they need to. We also understand that effective remediation intervenes in those areas of weakness and trains them up. We're not trying to work around the problem, recruiting other parts of the brain to jump in. We're really just going back to how systematic, how explicit, and how intensive does the intervention need to be for that child to launch in reading. so that they can get good enough at it to where they forget that they're actually having to read to understand. If you want to know more information, the go-to book remains Overcoming Dyslexia by Sally and Bennett Shaywitz. They're out of Yale University and have pioneered some of the neuroimaging studies that we use for reading. Let's jump into the next one, phonics. Phonics is the relationship between those phonemes that we hear or process and the letters that represent those. And automatically we know we have more sounds when we do letters, so there's a kind of an intricate seating chart of what letters are used to represent what sounds, and it turns out that not any letter is happy to stand next to any other letter. They get kind of funny about who they like to hang out with. An example of that is like the letter E. If there's only one E in a single syllable word, it gets booted to the back of the word. If there are two, they hang out in the middle of the word. And learning that seating chart and how those map together is actually kind of an involved process. It's amazing some kids seem to get that pretty easily, but other kids need a lot of specific coaching. So where phonemic awareness is all about sounds, phonics has print present in that instruction, and we're matching those sounds to letters. Turns out that there are a variety of ways that phonics can be taught. Synthetic phonics is one method where you actually have someone work sound by sound, letter by letter, blending it all together, synthesizing it. Analytical phonics says, well, we're going to take the whole word, we're going to say the whole word, then we're going to back into each sound. Analogy-based phonics says, well, if you know the word stump, you ought to be able to do the word jump, or if you know brick, you ought to be able to do something like kick, and you try to know other words based on analogy of the one that you started with. Phonics through spelling, or even embedded phonics, which says we're really not going to teach phonics, but when we come up to teachable moments, I'll tell you what I think is helpful for you to know in that moment. And it turns out that one of these works enormously better than all of the others. Care to take a stab at it? Synthetic phonics. We know for sure, beyond a shadow of a doubt, if we teach building up from sound to letters and then how letters work together to blend to form a whole word, if we build up through it, we get a significantly better outcome than if we try to back into it or teach it incidentally. So it should be taught explicitly. If you were having someone to learn Morse code, you would ordinarily, if you wanted someone to learn it well, you would teach them the code. And so the same holds true here. It should be systematic, and the question is how much does each child need for them to get it the way they need to? But it is a means to an end. It is not where we end the reading process. So in summary, good readers rely on letters and the words. Eye tracking studies show us very clearly when good readers come to words they don't know, their eyes go to the interior features of that word as they sort it out. Poor readers circle the word, they look at the words ahead of it, after it, and then they guess what they think the word is. So we want to coach kids to be able to do that systematically. And that holds true whether you're in 2nd grade, 8th grade, or senior in high school. When someone comes to that word, have them work through it. Bring their eyes to the word, start with vowels, break it into syllables if they need to, but you'd be amazed at how many kids in high school from good competitive schools still struggle at sounding out multi-syllable words. So we can't expect that we end instruction in 3rd grade or 5th grade in that. That needs to scale up all the way through, and that needs to be an even instructional plan for a student all the way K through 12. So if you're doing vocabulary with a student in 12th grade or 11th grade, it's understanding, do you know how that word works? Can you break into syllables? Do you understand what the sounds are doing? You might even bring in the idea that this is influenced by Latin with that ending, for example. So this scales all the way up. And that really becomes important because we need people to read fluently. And this is where you aren't just reading accurately, but you're reading with expression. And so let's talk about that. Fluency is a person's ability to read both with speed, accuracy, and expression. Now, sadly, there's been a strong push over the years to read with speed, and that is not particularly helpful. That process needs to be driven really by what's called prosody or expression. So in the end, automaticity is fast, effortless word recognition without expression. Really, fluency includes that expressiveness. So let's step through this. Read this out loud. What do you see? A, B, C. Not a particularly exciting book, huh? What about this? You get the idea. Oh, there we go, right? So we really need it to become alive so that there's some, that they have the opportunity to start hitching up comprehension to the process. We can try to quantitate this thing that's very qualitative, is looking at a rubric that basically can guide us to how much expression and volume is the student presenting, how's their phrasing, how smooth is it, what's their pace. And so we can start to attend to this and start to get a lot of information about how someone's reading. Fluent readers read words pretty automatically. They read effortlessly with expression. They're not concentrating on decoding. And they can focus on comprehension. That's where we need to be. And with that then comes a person who's reading for pleasure or ideally for fun, but they're reading daily. And that becomes important because in third grade, for a child who's reading about 30 minutes a day, they're reading on an average about 657,000 words a year. A great reader is reading over 1 million words a year, but a poor reader is reading about 250,000. And most of you know that people who read poorly are not reading 30 minutes a day every day, because that's torture. So the numbers of words that they're reading are actually significantly lower. And that becomes a problem because they're not getting nearly the same amount of practice that they need. And that'll fold into something I'm going to be going to here in a second. So when fluency isn't working well, we have to understand where the breakdown is. Is it a decoding breakdown? Are they not familiar with the text? Are they limited in their vocabulary? Or do they just have an inherently slower processing speed that's pulling down that? Each of those require different actions. It looks like the same thing potentially, but when we unpack it, we've got to figure out where it is and dive into that particular area. So for example, if there's more than one error for every 10 words, we really need to look at their reading accuracy and figure out why they're having trouble lifting those words off the page. If there are very few errors but low rate, then we need to start looking at fluency exercises to work on that tempo. If they're reading less than 30 to 40 words a minute period, then we need to look at what's happening with their core of basic words and why they're struggling through that. So this is just to get your mind thinking about the different kinds of things that can go on when we see someone who's having trouble in fluency, whether they're in third grade or 12th grade. And if we push the speed component, then everything else will collapse. And so there's been a really unproductive push for words read correctly per minute, believing that the faster someone reads, then the better they're going to be. And it turns out that reading rate is not a race. We actually understand that a 50th percentile reading rate is right on spot. We look at like we do a pulse or a blood pressure. You don't want high blood pressure and you don't want low blood pressure. You really kind of need an optimal range there. It also turns out that silent reading does nothing to improve reading fluency. So if you have a student for whom you're worried about their reading and you're having them read silently in the class for 20 minutes while other kids are doing things, you're not actually, there's no evidence in any way whatsoever that supports that will help that child improve their reading. Now, if they're already a great reader and they can read for pleasure, to build vocabulary, and that's meaningful. But if there's a person who's having difficulty in reading, silent reading is not, there's no study that's shown that that's been productive.
We were not able to find evidence to support that reading off by yourself silently helps children to read more fluently or to read better in any other way.
So what we do know helps is daily practice, timed repeated readings, setting goals, and tracking those goals. The timed repeated readings include reading with guidance and feedback so that there's someone reading aloud and they're getting direct feedback. But here's where this really starts to play in a way that's concerning. Children with word recognition difficulties avoid reading. it's extremely difficult for them to catch up to their peers. So for that child who is reading 250,000 words, compared to the child reading 1 million words a year, there becomes what we call in the field of reading a practice deficit. Such that, like if you were running a marathon, most people are sort of in the herd in the middle, right? But if you start to fall back, there is a certain point after which the race is far enough along that even if you sprint, you can still not catch up to the pack. And that happens in reading. And so we call that the Matthew effect. And we can see here, back to this gap in the early years, by the time end of 3rd grade, there is a large enough split between struggling readers and successful readers that it becomes very difficult to catch up. But that gap can be traced to very early on in 1st grade. So we can know a lot down here that we can reset this curve. It's a whole lot easier to reset the curve here than it is there, which is why when we look at those scores for 8th grade readers early on, you know, we saw that in 4th grade, those same scores. If we don't correct it early, it just gets harder and harder to do. So let's talk about vocabulary. Obviously, understanding the words you hear. Well, we know there's a lot of interesting data around it, and basically a lot of it points to how important it is, frankly. It's a very strong predictor of comprehension. Students with poor vocabulary by 3rd grade have declining text comprehension scores in 4th and 5th. It's interesting, a single book improves significantly children's expressive vocabulary. So a little can go a long way. We understand that it needs to be taught both directly and indirectly. Repetition is key for it. Multiple exposures are important. And learning it authentically as well in rich contexts. But what's interesting, all that you already know. What's interesting is what the science tells us about how we can think about words and maybe even how to approach them in teaching. We can divide words up into 3 tiers. 1st tier, 2nd tier, 3rd. A tier 1 word is really kind of a basic word like run or ball or this sort of core basic word. 2nd tier words tend to be really academic words, things that show up cross-curricularly, where a 3rd tier word is a word that tends to be content specific. But in terms of teaching it, the cool thing about the access to computers that we have is we can pretty well, so much has been digitized, we can do very large-scale studies on enormous amounts of words. So this one group looked at over 283 million words that make up sort of academic content. And so that included journal articles, British academic spoken English, the Michigan Corpus of Academic Spoken Words, academic journals, over hundreds of textbooks, and they just started putting all these words together, and they started to try to sort out what are just the basic words you need. So from that, they pulled out basically 2,800 words that make up what they call the new general service list. Of these 2,800 words, the new general service list gives more than 90% coverage for learners when they're trying to read most general texts of English. This is important because a person who knows all those words on the list and their related families would understand approximately 90 to 95% of colloquial speech and 80 to 85% of common written texts. So that's sort of like, you gotta know these words. Like, that's just key. And then from there, we switch into what are called academic words, of which the new academic word list kind of dovetails along with the new general service list to give us about 960 words that are considered academic words. And these are sort of the most important words for understanding academic text. And so examples of words off the new general service list are the ones you can see here, like from, fully, funny, game, garden, gas, general. And then we get into academic words like afterward, artistic, collective, computation. Analyze is a word that I think is a great example of an academic word, because you're going to hear it in art class, and you're going to hear it in English class, and you're going to hear it in math or science. It's just this cross-curricular word. And there are about, again, like 960 of those. And so when you have command of that, you've really opened the path up for comprehension, which gets us into meaning. Comprehension is intentional thinking during which meaning is constructed through the interaction. through interactions between the text and the reader. I really hate these like super cerebral sentences, but it's really this idea of just constructing meaning from print. And so when we look at the National Reading Panel components, there are a number of pieces that become key. And so this idea of getting one's mind engaged and prepared for reading, we talk about kind of predicting. So before we start, it's like, what do you think you're going to be covering? Let's engage our mind in that area. What are things we might be prepared for? What have we learned about last? What did we cover? So you kind of bring them in to the process. And then we want to engage this sort of metacognitive underpinning so that a person starts to really think about how they think. That they're aware of what they understand, they're aware of what they may be not understanding, and they have this real active role in how they're participating with the text. But it's mindful and intentional. They then can start to understand, as they may generate questions about the text or answer questions, that questions kind of fall in certain categories. Like there's some questions that are just like right there in the text. There are other questions that require me to think about that. There's no one spot that it says it, but as I read them, it kind of creates this sort of picture that goes toward that answer. Others require me to draw from my background experience and then bring from the text in. And so a person who's metacognitively engaged with the text can do that thinking, and they can talk about that. It's not just something that they're just like a passenger in the vehicle that's going, but they're actively engaged in that. And that's what we're trying to engage, and you all know that well. One part, though, I want to step into is this last area, visualization. Okay, I'd like to pick someone to read this loudly for the group. Who feels like they are having a good decoding day? So according to the story, what did the woman do? Yeah, she drid with some frode, of course. Yeah, and where did she grunch? She did, right there in the theft. So you all answered all the questions about that story, so clearly you understand it, right? Yeah. So then, if you didn't understand it, are you perhaps suggesting that someone could memorize something up and do adequately on a test, and yet having never understood it? Absolutely. Absolutely. And frankly, you would be surprised at the number of people that are diligent, conscientious students that grind away memorizing stuff that they really don't understand. And actually, I met with a family this morning who have a 9th grade daughter who's at a competitive private school making pretty decent grades, who struggles with very low comprehension scores and holds a tremendous amount of anxiety around school because of this. So the question is, what is it that we need to be doing to understand language so that it's not having to be memorized? And again, this is 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade through 12th. This is all the way through, because at many different levels, it's like the floor gets pulled out from under us. We have concrete language in these early years, and the tests generally ask us to just do a recall. But then as we scale up, less and less information, we ask less direct recall and more interpretive questions, where we really have to understand it. So what do we need to be doing to understand what we read so that we're not being forced to memorize? What does that student need to bring to the process? Let's do this one. Someone else read. What did you do in your mind to understand it? You have a picture. you have a picture. And it's that component of the reading process that's a deal breaker for a kid to understand versus memorize. So as language comes in, it is either going to go in one ear and out the other, or it's going to go in one ear and be stored in memory, not to be understood, or it's going to go in terms of a movie, an image that matches the author's intent, that they then have the ability to go, aha, I get it. It's when that happens that a student can start to leverage all the other skills that they need to do to understand. All the other skills I started with hinge upon this fundamental factor. Let's see what this actually could look like in real life.
What I'm learning is when you read, you form a story in your mind, a movie in your head. And Stephen McCrocklin here, and is that an easy thing to do for students?
Not for some. Some people do that automatically and just instinctively do that. But others don't see that movie. And so for them, reading is just a bunch of ink on the page.
Yeah, and so we're going to do a little story here, a little example. Now Claudia is helping out Nan here to visualize, so she'll read the sentence, and then we'll see what you hear and what you see in your brain. Okay, go Claudia.
The fox gets rid of its fleas in a clever fashion. Holding a stick in its mouth, the fox wades into the water backwards.
Okay. All right. So what do you see there? What's going on in your head?
All right, I'm getting a scraggly, wet fox backing into the water a little awkwardly, and he's trying to drown the fleas, but he doesn't want to drown himself because he's distracted. So he puts the stick in his mouth to keep him afloat.
And what happened here? Oh, look at that! Magically, that's what we see here. And he's moving backwards, and this kind of like one frame at a time, building this movie. Now I noticed that Nan added a couple of other kind of descriptive words and kind of built the story too.
She did. And reading ought to be fun and alive in your mind. And so as you read these words, these stories can come alive as a full picture.
And then, okay, let's go with the second half here.
As the water rises, fleas rush toward the fox's head. Then, to avoid drowning, they go down its nose and onto the twig. The fox lets go of the twig and comes to shore, minus the fleas.
So what you got going on?
All right, so he's realized that they're not going to drown because they're holding on. So he keeps backing into the water. Now he's wet, so he looks a little bit ridiculous. But they come up, they climb up him, and they just these sad little wet bugs, and they climb onto the stick. So then he, with a flourish, just tosses it over his head and walks out with
You throw in those other little things like that. It's all different style. The fox comes out. But this is a pretty straightforward story. Now we get into other kind of books and authors, and it can be tricky.
It can be tricky. And so certainly this is a fairly straightforward passage, as you said. As we go to more higher levels of learning with more vocabulary, things can happen out of sequence, and the story can be more abstract. You're left with having to do more of that creating on your own.
So those words can translate into a full motion picture in your mind. But it's important that your pictures match the author's intent. So good students are very efficient at taking that language in, getting a picture that's lifelike and the right amount of details there to support the idea, and then they're on to the next thing. And they can do that while they read. But again, not as many kids do this as well as you might expect. And so having some dialogue around that, and that's where you start to problem solve. So a student with good metacognition is aware of their pictures. They're aware when they stop. They'll go back to the spot and figure out the part that they didn't understand. And that's the difference between a student coming up to you at the end of class going, you know, I wasn't quite clear when we talked about this part of it. I didn't really understand what that meant. As opposed to the student who goes, I have no idea what we did today. They don't even know where to start because there are no pictures. So there's a difference between having no pictures and a gap in the picture. The metacognitively prepared student who's got the bulk of their pictures but needs some filling in can ask the right question in the right way to fill their thinking gap. And so think about that as you start to see kids and as they're asking questions in class of you. So if you're having a roundtable discussion in high school and it's a robust conversation, and yet there's one or two people who keep asking these questions that are kind of off topic. It's like you know they're trying and they're invested, but their question just kind of takes things off track. And that's the person where you want to know, like, what are you seeing? Like, where are you picturing this? Because you're seeing it from a different perspective than where I'm trying to help you get. Let's keep that in mind. Certainly writing hinges upon this as well. A good writer has their thoughts together. They might use a graphical organizer to organize it, but then it comes out in this way that they're intending to, so that the reader can make their picture in their mind from their words. In the end, all these components of reading come together so that we're ideally weaving all these pieces together. So while there's an emphasis in the early years in phonemic awareness and phonics, there's no reason at all why, if you're in high school or late middle school working with a child where they're reading something, they come to a word they don't know, you want to make sure that they know the vocabulary of it, and you want to make sure that they understand how that word is built. So that you can syllabicate it into its components, talk about it, and build it back up. You might bring in what's the root word, where does that come from? Because that will further guide the meaning. Some of you do this instinctively, others of you may not know that what you're doing instinctively is valuable and you need to keep doing it. Others might wonder, gosh, where do I spend my time? Like, what does the research tell me that's worth my time, that's going to help the kid, versus what's sort of extra? So hopefully this will help kind of bring that together for you, so you know the parts that really matter and maybe the parts that don't. I want to shift to kind of another piece here. So we understand that good readers and good teachers weave all this together, so you end up with this self-correcting, self-monitoring, independent, reading, thinking person. But when bumps happen, the question is, what do we do with that? So we have a kid that's not progressing. What we're at great risk for sometimes is following a belief that we have, and there's some held beliefs that maybe don't play out so well. So there are some things that bubble up at times that I think are helpful to understand. One is visual interventions for reading, brain training, movement-based interventions, and learning styles. So let's talk about what these bring and what we understand about them. One thing that often will happen, and we see this a fair amount, is that a child who's having difficulty in the early years, the kinds of errors that student makes and the way we interpret them might suggest to a reasonable person that there's a visual problem that's interrupting that person's ability to read. And we think of reading, again, in an uninformed way as this visual process. And it's really not so much visual-based as much as it is a language process. So there's been a lot of study in this area, and we know now from the American Academy of Pediatrics, a large position paper that was written along with the American Association for Pediatric Ophthalmology and other groups that say this: vision problems can interfere with the process of learning. However, vision problems are not the cause of primary dyslexia or learning disabilities. Scientific evidence does not support the efficacy of eye exercises, behavioral vision therapy, or specially tinted filters or lenses for improving long-term education performance in these complex pediatric neurocognitive conditions. And so we wish that it was as easy as putting a colored lens in or a colored transparency, that doing eye exercises and other pieces would work out a person's decoding difficulties, but it turns out that they just don't impact it. We absolutely have to have good acuity. We need to be able to see letters well. But the idea that letters would hop around the page or that we would see something in reversed form is not really, doesn't really happen. If we were prone for those kinds of errors, we would be driving along mountain roads in Colorado, see a left turn, and think it was a right turn, and we drive our car off the cliff. When we look at these kids who have pursued these options, it certainly doesn't hurt them, but what happens is it prolongs the necessary interventions that actually remediate the difficulties. So we're back to those curves and graphs that I've shown. If we wait a year or two, we're missing valuable time because kids, the less exposure you're getting to words and the less fluent you're reading, the harder it is to catch up. The next thing that we were very hopeful about in the field of reading and learning was brain training. And the premise here is that someone who might have difficulty with working memory or processing speed, that if that were improved, everything else downstream would work better. And so that embarked on a process of trying to build up, say, working memory or processing speed. Now, what happens there is a person does specific kinds of practice in that area, whether it's a working memory task or a processing speed task, And what turns out is they get better at doing that task. But the hope would be that not only do you get better at that task, you get that other things related, that generalizes, and other related things get better with it, and that idea of rising tides raise all boats, everything gets better. It turns out, sadly, that that's not what happens at all. What happens is you get better at that particular game, but it doesn't generalize into something else. So if you get faster at a naming task, it doesn't mean you're faster at tying your shoelaces or doing math minutes. So it turns out that whatever it is that you want to improve, you have to work on that specifically. So if you want to get to become a fluent or a faster reader, you have to do more reading. It's the process that you practice is the one that gets better. And the most definitive research was done, the most definitive paper was an 84-page paper published in the Association for Psychological Sciences that did a large study of all the studies that had been done, and they basically conclusively came out and said, we're sorry, but there's just not evidence that it impacts anything other than what you're working on. The next area that we often see people kind of spend time on that turns out not to play out so well are very specific movement-based interventions. And so this would include someone who's doing a lot of work to cross the midline, where there are particular kinds of exercises that are believed to help the brain connect in a more fuller way. And it's very hard to find any data that supports that works better than just exercise in general. What we know is when kids get out and play and move, increased blood flow and increased cognitive activity. If you're tired at your desk and you get up and walk around and move or go do 10 jumping jacks, you come back more alert. But the specific exercise you do tends to not matter much. So whether you're crossing a midline or just lifting a weight up and down, it has the same impact, and it's what the data is showing us. I want to talk about learning styles because this is a sure shot, right? So we know that kids learn different ways, and our job as a teacher is to understand what way they learn, so if we teach to that way, they'll get it better. Makes sense, right?
Hi, my name is Dan Willingham. I'm a cognitive psychologist and a neuroscientist. I'm also a professor at the University of Virginia. I'm going to talk to you today about learning styles and how cognitive psychologists know that they don't exist. Now, the basic idea of learning styles seems to make a lot of sense. The idea is that different people have different ways of learning. So if you can teach in a way that's consistent with a student's style, he or she should learn better.
There have been lots of these proposals over the years, like verbalizers versus visualizers, or analytic versus non-analytic thinkers. I'm going to talk about what is the best known, visual versus auditory versus kinesthetic learners, but what I'm going to say about this theory really goes for all the others too. So what are learning style theories? The idea is that the way that information is organized, or the way that you think about it, matters in how easily you understand or learn it. Suppose you're building a new house and you're trying to give your friend a sense of what it will be like. The visual learner will understand best by seeing the plans, the auditory learner by listening to a description of the house, and kinesthetic learners need to move, so your kinesthetic friend might build a model. The theory says that anyone can learn in any of the three ways, so the mostly visual person can still learn auditorily or kinesthetically, and likewise for the mostly kinesthetic person. But the brain doesn't work that way. It is true that you can store memories in any of those three formats. Suppose I ask you, what's the shape of a German Shepherd's ears? Most people say that they look at a visual mental image when they answer that question, and there is good evidence that you do indeed store that information visually. Or if I ask, who has a deeper voice, your best friend or your boss? You'll sort of listen in your mind's ear, and those sounds are stored auditorily. Kinesthesia is a little trickier, but it works the same way. Movements that you know really well, like riding a bicycle or tying shoelaces, will be stored kinesthetically. And yes, it's probably true that some people have clear, vivid images and some have weak, undetailed images. Almost any characteristic of people is going to vary, whether it's height or weight or visual memory. So in that sense, some people are good visual thinkers. Okay, so that's the scientific background, and it sort of sounds like the theory is right? Let me tell you what's wrong. Think about what the theory ought to predict. Here's a visual learner, and here's an auditory learner. Suppose I give each of them 2 lists of words to learn. For one list, I read it aloud, auditory presentation, and for another list, I show a series of slides, a visual presentation. Later, everybody gets a test. The prediction is straightforward. The visual learner should learn the slides better than the words, and the auditory learner should learn the words better than the slides. Lots of people have done that experiment, and that's not the result you get. The thing is, you don't learn the words visually or auditorily. Actually, an auditory test would be about what the particular sound of the voice was, the auditory quality. For example, did you hear shell or shell? And a visual test would be for the particular visual qualities of the slides, what they actually look like. When you just ask people to remember the words, you're really asking them to remember meaning, not sound or visual information. And in fact, most of what teachers want students to learn is not visual or auditory or kinesthetic information. It's meaning-based. For example, you know what the word opera means. For you, that's a meaning-based representation. And the meaning is independent of whether you learn the meaning by first seeing an opera or hearing an aria. Most of what's in your head, especially what you learned at school, is meaning-based. So you might think, okay, but the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic idea is still right some of the time, like when teachers want students to learn things that are not meaning-based. It's true, sometimes students might learn things that are essentially visual, like the shapes of countries on a map, or something that's essentially auditory, like a correct French accent. But notice what the theory's prediction would be. The prediction of the theory is not simply people with good auditory memory will be better at learning auditory stuff than people with average auditory memory. No one would argue with that. The prediction is that an auditory learner is always going to learn better if you present things auditorily, because that's supposed to be his or her best modality. Well, that's pretty obviously silly. You're not going to try to come up with an auditory presentation of the shape of Algeria. Everybody needs to see it.
Okay, so let me summarize what I've said so far. It's true that some people have a better visual memory than other people, and other people are better at learning auditory material than other people are. But that fact isn't really all that important for teachers, because most of what teachers want students to learn is not particularly visual or auditory or kinesthetic. Most of what teachers want students to learn is based on meaning. The second point concerns the particular prediction of the theory. The important prediction of the theory is not that some people have better visual memory than other people. The prediction is that those people with a good visual memory will always learn better if you present things visually. But that idea is clearly wrong. When you've got something that you want students to learn that's especially visual, like the shape of a country on a map, everybody needs to see a visual presentation, not just those people who have really good visual memory. Okay, so if the theory is wrong, as I'm claiming, why does it seem so right?
One reason is that everyone believes it, not just teachers. The theory is accepted by about 90% of the students at the University of Virginia. Second reason people believe it is that something close to the theory is right. People can learn in different ways, and some people are especially good at learning certain types of information. But the specific predictions of the theory and the way that you would apply it in the classroom are wrong. A third reason this theory seems right is that if you already believe it, you'll probably interpret ambiguous situations as consistent with the theory. For example, suppose you're talking to a student about the structure of the atom, but it's not really clicking. Finally, you say, picture the solar system. The nucleus of an atom is like the sun, and the electrons are like the planets spinning around it. The student understands, and you think, aha, he must be a visual learner. But maybe that was just a good analogy that would have helped any student. Or maybe the student needed just one more example for the idea to click. Why the student understood at that point is actually ambiguous. But if you already believe the theory, you're likely to interpret what happened as being consistent with the theory. Remember, there are many theories about learning styles. Visual, auditory, and kinesthetic is just one. But what I've said about that theory goes for the others too.
Good teaching is good teaching, and teachers don't need to adjust their teaching to individual students' learning styles.
What we're asking kids to do in school, ideally, is not to store memories, it's to understand. And so beyond the input modality and memory is our understanding.
A lot of people have said, so does this mean that you think that students are interchangeable, classes are interchangeable? The answer to that is of course not, and it's sort of obvious that teachers do differentiate instruction and should, based on things like students' motivation, students' personality, students' interests, and so on. And that makes sense. And I wouldn't want a child of mine in a classroom where a teacher didn't at least try to do that. But learning style theories are not theories of personality and motivation or interest. Learning style theories are theories about the mechanism by which learning takes place. And the theory says, here is a characterization of how learning works, and it's different in different types of children, and teachers ought to act on those differences and teach children differently according to the precepts of the theory. And what I'm arguing is there's no evidence to support any of the existing theories. Now, the fact that teachers shouldn't differentiate instruction based on learning style theories doesn't mean that teachers should never differentiate instruction in any way. I'm just arguing that these theories are wrong and this is not a good way to differentiate instruction.
The intention here is to free you up as a teacher to not get too busy about how do I teach it so an individual person learns with their learning style, but to free you up to say, how is this topic best covered? In the end, a lot of work has been done to understand how kids learn to read, where they get stuck, and what we can do. And that's the course that we want to move forward in. There are lots of things that can help derail our thinking to move away from that, but there is a roadmap, and it works reliably well. And so as you see students who are progressing well, you can know in your mind what things that they're doing well and what bridges they've crossed to get to where they are. And for kids that are maybe not progressing quite as well, now you have some tools to start picking through where might the breakdown be? Where do I intervene? How do I support? And help kind of weave all this together without necessarily leapfrogging into something else. Stay focused on what we know to be true so far, and you'll see the results from it. Thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.